In the pure concarole puan, T you like Gambian Talent TV. In the pure concacao fossa, T you like Gambian Talent TV. In the pure conbilling, T you like The Baran Gambian Talent TV. In the pale kumbilingi, T you like Gambia, the Baran Gambian Talent TV, the Chirkarole Puar, Kanyan in the road.
Karasu Properties and Investment Limited, ye can also dale lamen karawan, 20 by 20.
Jiobeje, Kurangabeje. Ninsun Karobu Nyanala Horomo Kang,
Iba wafila $200,000
cash.
Ikafumim fane mortgage ka domon ninjo katafo kariworo, ibo wafila $250,000. Kairosu Properties and Investment Limited, Ibal Contender Sunkarolo. Kairosu Properties. Link us and we make you a home builder.
Council, are we ready to resume our proceedings? If we are, please proceed.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Over to Sagar Jahate. She would lead us. She would lead the next witness, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fall. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Good afternoon, everyone. I am ready to proceed with the witness. Mr. Usher, can you please get the witness? Thank you. Kindly swear the witness, Mr. Usher.
I, Deyda Jawo.
I, Deyda Jawo.
Do swear that.
Do swear that.
I'll speak the truth.
I'll speak the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Witness.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the Trrc.
Thank you.
And thank you for agreeing to give your testimony to us.
Thank you.
As you know, my name is Sagar. I've already introduced myself. I'd just like to take you through some of the rules and regulations we have here at the Trrc for witnesses who are testifying. As you know, you're quite soft-spoken, so if you could just raise your voice whilst you testify so that we can all hear you. Also, can you take a very slow pace so that the interpreters will be able to interpret your testimony easily into the local languages. Also speak directly into the mic.
Thank you. I'll try. I'll do my level best.
All right. I would like to remind you also that you have a duty to tell the truth. I'll just provide you with a brief overview of the topics that we'll be covering here today. We'll go through some of your personal details, as well as your educational background, some of your professional qualifications, training and experience, your professional career as a journalist and the different institutions that you worked under during your career, your experience as a full-time and freelance journalist in the Gambia during the previous regime, and other literary works that you may have done, some of the books that you actually authored. We would also like to hear your view on the political climate that you operated under during the time that you were serving as a journalist, and what impact, if any, that climate had on press freedom and rights in general. And also we might ask you just to touch a little bit on the general human rights situation in the Gambia, as well as human rights violations suffered directly by journalists who were particularly targeted and also persecuted collectively as a profession. We would like you to touch on the harassment and detention of non-Gambian and Gambian staff alike at the Daily Observer newspaper where you worked, as well as the arrest, detention, and torture of some of your colleagues, your personal arrest and detention at the NIA, and personal threats and intimidation you actually suffered, and the use of the law as a means of persecuting journalists. This is just generally what we will require you to speak on, and any other areas that you feel you would like to come to the attention of the Commission. Are you ready to proceed with your testimony?
Yes, Counsel, I'm ready.
Very well. What are your full names?
My name is Deyda Jawo.
Are you known by any other names?
D.A Jawo, most people know me by.
Because I've heard some of the witnesses refer to you as DA or Uncle DA.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Okay. Can you provide your address and your occupation?
I live at Canifing Housing Estate. Right now, I'm not employed because, since I left the government in June 2018, I've not had any permanent employment yet, although I'm doing some consultancy, but certainly no permanent employment yet.
And under what circumstances did you leave the government? What was your last appointment?
I was Minister of Information and Communication Infrastructure until 29th of June 2018, when there was a cabinet reshuffle, and I was one of those who was removed from the government.
And when did you take up that position?
It was February 2017 that I was appointed.
Can you tell us where you attended primary and secondary education, please?
I attended primary school in Mount Carmel Primary School, which is in Sambang in Nyamina West, in the CRR. That was from 1961, 62 to 1966.
And where did you attend secondary school?
From Sambang, I went to Crab Island Junior Secondary School from 1966 to 1970. Unfortunately, I could not, of course I had the pass at the end of the junior secondary school to go to high school, but because my parents didn't have the means, so I had to leave school at that stage.
And did you do anything when you left school at that stage?
Yes, I had to take up employment as an unqualified teacher, and I was posted to Karantaba Primary School, that is in Kiang West in the Lower River region. That was from 1970 to 71.
And were you working with the Gambia government at that point?
Yes, I was an unqualified teacher under the Ministry of Education then, yeah.
Can you tell us, after you did that, what you did next?
From after that academic year, the following year, that was 71, 72, actually I sat to the college entrance exams, and I was supposed to go to the Yundum College to train as a teacher. But due to some communication breakdown, I didn't get my letter, of acceptance on time, and I couldn't go for that academic year. It was the following academic year that I actually went to the college. That was in 1972.
And did you complete your training at the college?
Sorry for answering. I should have given enough time at least. But in 1974, after 2 years at the college, I had to resign, and then later on I joined the Gambia Utilities Corporation as a stores officer. That was in 1974.
And whilst you were at the GUC, as it was called then, did you undergo any kind of professional training there?
Yes, I did. In 1979, I went to the UK to train, in purchasing and management with the Crown agents.
Did you do anything else? Any other training?
Yes. After that training, I also underwent another training on, on commerce, that is in Canada in 1989, again under the auspices of the Gambia Utilities Corporation. Yeah.
And how long were you at GUC?
I was at GUC from 1974 to 1993, when the GUC was then taken over by the Management Services Gambia Limited, MSG it was called. And there was a massive retrenchment exercise, that is redundancy, and I was one of those whose services were, done away with.
Whilst you were at the GUC, did you combine that work with any other work?
Yes, my passion then was definitely journalism, and while I was at the GUC, I was also doing some freelance journalism, and most of the time I was based at the Nation newspaper on Boxbar Road, which was then run by William Dixon Colley, one of the veteran journalists in this country.
And you mentioned that you left the GUC after it was taken over by MSG, I believe.
Yes, MSG, yes.
Yes, and what happened next? Where did you go?
In that year, 1993, as I was very much interested in journalism, I decided to go to the Daily Observer then, to continue my journalism career. And this time my intention was to become a full-time journalist instead of just doing freelance work.
What motivated you to become a full-time journalist, and what was your motivation as well for choosing the Daily Observer as an institution to work for?
Journalism, as I said, was definitely my passion. I was very much interested in, writing about things which were happening. And Daily Observer, I could have gone to the Nation because that's where I used to spend most of my time, But I thought probably now that I've decided to become a full-time journalist instead of just doing freelance work, Daily Observer I saw as a very ideal place to work as a full-time journalist because, it was a much bigger newspaper and also much better facilities and so many experienced journalists who were working there. I thought probably working with those people, could help me enhance my, professional career as well as a journalist.
At the time, who owned the Daily Observer newspaper?
It was owned by Kenneth Best. He was a Liberian refugee who had to run over to the Gambia. What actually happened was the Daily Observer existed in Liberia then, but during the Civil War, when he just found it difficult to operate in that country, he decided to relocate to the Gambia.
Apart from being an owner, did he occupy any other position in the Observer?
Yes, he was apart from being the owner, he was also the managing director, as well as, the overall boss of the editorial team.
And you went to the Observer, and what was your position there when you started?
I started initially as a freelance reporter for the paper, but just about maybe a month or two, I was taken on board on a permanent basis, and I was made a reporter. Well, I was made the court reporter then, so I was mostly covering the courts.
Can you just explain what freelance journalism was, or what it was to be a freelance journalist?
Freelance journalist in the real sense means journalist who is not attached to any particular media house per se, who can just write or, sell his or her stories to any newspaper. But in the Gambia also it can mean you can be attached to a particular newspaper, but you are not a staff reporter. All you do is that you are paid according to the stories that you get published.
And what positions did you occupy after you became a reporter? How did you rise through the ranks?
I continued as a reporter for some time. You know, as I said, I was attached to the courts, so I was doing some court reporting mostly. But in 1996, then the news editor of the paper, that is Ibrahim Assise, left the country and went to the UK, so I was appointed as the news editor.
And what did your work entail as news editor?
As news editor, I was mostly responsible for assigning reporters to various coverages, as well as editing news items as well. You know, so I was responsible. You know, I mean, the paper had different kind of editors. You have the sports editor, who is mostly responsible for sports issues dealing with sports. Then you have the news editor, who is responsible mostly for news items as well, and etc. So that was my responsibility as news editor.
And how long were you at Observer? Can you tell us when you started and when you finished your assignment there?
Yes, as I said, I joined the Observer in 1993 after I was retrenched from the GUC. And in 1999, I had my services terminated because what happened was the Observer, which was then owned by Kenneth Best, somehow after Mr. Best was deported from this country in 1994, he still continued to own the Observer until 1999, where he decided to sell it to Amadou Samba.
Can you tell us who Amadou Samba was?
Amadou Samba was a Gambian businessman, and I guess he's still a Gambian businessman. But he was then very close to the regime, to President Yaya Jammeh, the former president, and he was very much identified with the regime. And so that was it.
And did anything happen after he took over ownership of Observer?
Yes, when he bought the paper in May 1999, about, I cannot remember the duration now, but I think not more than a week later, I received a letter, terminating my services. And the reasons given was that, they were restructuring the company. But, I thought that was just a, that was not the right reason for my termination. But I guess probably, they were not happy with some of the things I was writing, so I wasn't surprised at all.
Can you please take a sip of water, please?
Thank you. Well,
Mr. Usher, I think he needs. Where's
please,
Mr.
somebody
Usher?
help me get
He
this.
needs help with opening the water.
Okay, don't worry, I've done it.
After Amadou Samba took over the paper, you say you were made redundant, and you were given reasons which you did not believe were the true reasons. Can you tell us what you believe to be the real reason why you were made redundant?
Well, I used to have a popular column, weekly column on the Daily Observer, which was called Focus, and mostly on political, commentary I was making, and it was not very popular among the government because it was sometimes quite hard-hitting. But I thought probably, somebody didn't want me to continue to do such a thing, and that was maybe the reason why I was identified, to be sacked after the new management took over.
Can you tell us some of the articles you would write in that column? Just give us examples of what kind of criticisms you would make against the government.
Well, at that time we were in a transition. Then the junta had taken over, and we were involved in a transition, and a lot of things were not going the way people had wanted them to go, particularly the ordinary people of this country. So I was trying as much as possible to write about the people's feelings, their criticisms of the government, mostly on political issues, but as well as on any other issue. Like, for instance, a good example was we had this imam at State House, Imam Fati, who used to, kind of make a lot of criticisms, particularly against the Ahmadiyya and other people as well. So I remember writing a commentary on this particular, criticizing the imam and the government in particular, particularly President Jammeh himself, who was sitting right there while the imam was making such, comments. I remember at one time, the imam even made a summon on his pulpit, threatening me, and because they were not happy with what I had written about that, and a lot of other things I was also commenting about on that particular column.
And you believe that it was because of your stance, your independent stance against the government, that you were eventually dismissed from the Observer newspaper?
Yes, that was my belief.
It is also correct that the name of your column, Focus, is also the name of a book that you have since published.
Yes, what actually happened is after I left the Observer, that was in 2011, I thought maybe what I should do is I should get all the, comments, those commentaries on that particular column and compile them in a book form. So I called it The Focus. So those are, commentaries that I was making on the column in the Daily Observer.
When you were dismissed in 1999 from the Daily Observer, what did you do next?
For a time, I became a freelance journalist. I was writing, I was the Banjul correspondent for the Associated Press, and also briefly, I was the reporter for BBC African Service in this country as well. But in 2000, I joined the Independent as the editor-in-chief. As you know, then it was Dr. Deyda Jallow who was the editor-in-chief of the Independent. He left for the U.S. For studies, and he appealed to me if I can be able to help them and take over as editor-in-chief. And that is how I went to the Independent as editor-in-chief of the paper.
Can you just tell us briefly what your experience was as editor-in-chief of the Independent newspaper at the time?
Yes, the Independent was then not very popular with the government because it was very critical. It carried a lot of critical articles as far as the government was concerned. And let me just add also that, I started another column in the Independent called the Independent Critic, kind of saying exactly, very similar to what I was writing on my Focus column on the Daily Observer. So, the Independent became a kind of a thorn in the flesh of the regime, and things were not very cozy over there as far as the government was concerned, definitely.
And who were you working with at the time at the Independent?
Well, you had the proprietor of the paper, that was Deyda Jallow, who was then the managing editor of the paper. And we also had some reporters, I remember. I think there was this Ablai C, who was also with the paper. And I cannot remember all the others, but definitely, these are the people I was working with there.
And how long did you remain at the Independent?
Just for about a year, because in 2001, I decided to leave and continue as a freelance journalist. Yeah.
And which press institutions did you work with as a freelance journalist during this period?
Well, I continued with those that I was working with, because even when I was at the Independent, I was still the correspondent for Associated Press in this country, and also still doing some, work with BBC African Service. So I continued doing some work with them as well.
And did you occupy any other positions within the press fraternity during this time?
Yes, in 1998, I was elected president of the Gambia Press Union. I took over from the late Deyda Hydara. And so even that time, during the time I was at the Observer until I was sacked in 1999, and when I was at the Independent, I was also president of the Gambia Press Union.
And how long did you occupy that position?
It was supposed to be a 3-year term, but I handed over the presidency to Madi Cisse in 2005. We were supposed to have done the Congress in 2004, but for one reason or the other, we were unable to do the Congress. So instead of 6 years, I did 7 years, and in 2005, I had to hand over to Madi Cisse, who was elected as the new president.
Did you engage yourself in any other full-time work after that?
Yes, in 2005, I was appointed as the course director of a media training center. This was a UNESCO-run training center for journalists. As you know, at that time, we didn't have training facilities for journalists in this country, formal training facilities. But for the first time, UNESCO helped us to set up a media training center, and we were training journalists in there. So I was appointed as the course director for that center for 2005.
My apologies. And how long did you remain there?
About 1 year. The following year, 2006, I was approached by a friend, the late Suaibu Konate, that he wanted a Gambian, to take up an appointment in Dakar as editor of a news agency, the head of the English desk of a news agency, which was newly set up in Dakar. So I had to send in my CV. And I got the appointment. So eventually I went to Dakar to take up that appointment.
And how long did that appointment last?
I was there from 2006 up to 2017, when I was offered the ministerial position.
Can you tell us if you obtained any professional qualifications as a full-time journalist or as a professional journalist?
Yes. As you know, as I said, there were no formal journalism training facilities in this country. So, journalists had to learn the profession on the job most of the time in this country. People come from the classroom to the newsroom, and that was it, and then they get trained on the job. But some of us probably were a bit lucky that we had to go overseas and obtain some, kind of professional training. I first went to the International Institute of Journalism in Berlin, where I, underwent a 3-month training, and I got a diploma in journalism. And at one time also, that was in 1991. And in 1997 also, I was in Israel, where I was trained in, press enterprises, the running of press enterprises also in Israel. I think that also lasted about 3 months. And at one time, I'm not very definite about the year here, but I think it's 2003 or even before that. I was in Ghana, training as in news editing, So basically, well, of course, I also underwent other, local courses that we were holding here, like seminars and other things on. But basically, these were the kind of training that I underwent.
You've already mentioned that you authored a book called Focus. Did you author any other books apart from that?
Yes, in 2007, with a colleague friend of mine, Ahmed Alota, we jointly authored a book on the life of Deyda Hydara. It's called A Living Mirror, The Life of Deyda Hydara. And then in 2011, I had this Focus compiled, my Focus columns in a newsroom. And then recently, I've launched another book, It's called A Date with Destiny, which is, an autobiography. Yeah.
It seems you've had a change of career. You're now a writer, or you're heading to that direction.
Well, it appears, but I still consider myself a journalist, yeah.
Indeed. Can you just tell us who Ahmed Alota was, your co-author in the book A Living Mirror, The Life of Deyda Hydara?
Alota is a Nigerian journalist who's been living in this country for a very long time. In fact, he at one time worked at the Point newspaper with Deyda Hydara. And at one time also, he was kind of the head of the GPU secretariat. At the moment, he's doing his PhD in Canada. Yeah, but he's married to a Gambian, so I guess probably when he's ready over here, he'll come back here.
And what made you qualified to write a book on Deyda Hydara?
Deyda, I was very, very close to Deyda. We were friends, and I considered him as a mentor. When I joined the GPU in 1980, Deyda was then the vice chairman of the GPU. In fact, the GPU was then just 1 year old, because it was registered in 1979. And in 1980, I joined to become a member. And, I found Deyda there as the vice chairman of the GPU. And, since then, we became very close. I remember at one time, I was arrested by the police and detained at the police station in Banjul. That was in 1979. And Deyda was one of those people who was frequently visiting me at that place. So, I got very close to him, yeah.
Can you just tell us more about that particular arrest? Because I have noticed that this was in 1979, and this was before the Jammeh regime. Is that correct?
Yes, it was. What happened was, in 1979, I got an article published on the front page of the Nation newspaper. And this was, quite critical of what was happening in the police then. And, the police didn't take it lightly, so they arrested me and detained me at the Banjul police station. And, they detained me there for the whole day. Then in the evening, they asked me, to self-bail, and they let me go. But they asked me to be reporting every day. So every morning I'll go to the police, spend the whole day there. They'll leave me for about 2 weeks, and then Dixon Colley advised me, he said, don't go again. If they want, they can charge you and take you to court. So that's how I didn't go again. And that was the end of the matter. Yeah. All
right. Mr. Jawo, you are a seasoned and veteran journalist in this country, and you've given us an overview of your career, your qualifications, and some of the professional training you've gone through. I would just like to take you back to your time at the Daily Observer newspaper when you were just starting off your journalism career. Can you just tell us what it was like working at the Daily Observer newspaper at the time and who you worked closely with?
It was very, very interesting working at the Daily Observer. As I said, I was doing some freelance writing while I was working with the GUC. But this time, I was a full-time journalist. So, it was quite exciting. I had, very experienced journalists with me there. You had people like Dr. Baba Gale Jallow, for instance, was there with me. You had people like Ibrahim Assise, who was then the news editor. You had people like the late D.A Njai, that is Abla Njai. He was also another seasoned journalist who used to work for the Gambia Daily, and then he was employed. And of course, initially Kenneth Best was there also. Very interesting characters I used to work with there.
Can you've already explained a little bit about the role of the Daily Observer at the time, but can you just give us an idea of the position that this particular newspaper held, within the press community?
Before the setting up of the Daily Observer. Of course, maybe it was preceded by the Point. Point was set up in December 1991. But after the Point, the Daily Observer came in May 1992. These were the first kind of real newspapers in this country. Then we had just cyclo-style, sheets of paper that we used to call, newspaper in this country. They were just A4 size papers, written and then clipped together as newspaper. But then we got these newspapers which were kind of, desktop publishing. They were more professionally set up, and so the Observer was very popular then. It was, I think it was in fact the first daily paper in this country, even though the Point preceded it, but Point didn't become daily until later. So the Observer was the first daily paper in this country.
And would you say that many journalists today, especially the veteran journalists, passed through its hands?
Yes, it was like a training institution for Gambian journalists, because as I said, we had experienced editors in the paper, and most journalists in this country, particularly budding journalists, started with the Daily Observer. They got trained there, and they had to move on to other newspapers. It was like a training institution, definitely, for the journalists in this country.
And as a professional journalist, what did you understand your role to be in society?
The role of the journalists, we are, agents of information, and we are not supposed to be making the news, but actually conveying the news, from whatever the source we get the news to convey it to the people. So a journalist is, as it is described, a watchdog of society, and also supposed to, keep the authorities on their toes as far as national issues are concerned. So it's a very, very important role that a journalist should play in society.
And would you say that the journalists who were working under the Daily Observer newspaper were performing that role properly?
Yes, honestly. At that time, the Observer was definitely performing that role quite effectively.
Can you describe the staff makeup of the Observer newspaper in terms of their nationality? You've already mentioned the fact that the owner and managing director of the company, Kenneth Y. Best, was a Liberian national. Can you give us other examples, please?
Yes, when the Observer was being set up in this country in 1992, then journalism was not very much developed in this country. So, when Kenneth Best set up the Observer, he found it not very easy to get skilled and qualified journalists to take on board. So he had to bring a lot of non-Gambian journalists from Liberia, from Sierra Leone, from, you have Nigerians, you have Ghanaians, different people of different nationalities. But eventually, Gambian journalists started to get these skills, and they became more experienced as well. But initially, definitely, there were a lot of non-Gambian journalists within the Observer as well.
And would you say that these foreign staff at the Daily Observer were performing a key role in the company?
There is no doubt about that. As I said, journalism was not well developed in this country then. We didn't have very, experienced journalists at that time as such. So the paper relied a lot on these foreign journalists, non-Gambian journalists, and they were playing a very key role there, definitely.
You mentioned the deportation of Kenneth Best in 1994, I believe, 1994. Can you give us more background into the circumstances surrounding his deportation?
Yes, he was deported in October 1994. What actually happened was maybe a few days before that, he was picked up, taken to somewhere we didn't know. We tried to find his location, but we weren't sure where they had taken him. That is the authorities, the immigration authorities, I understand. And he was detained there for, I cannot remember the number of days he was detained there. Then eventually, from there, they just took him to the airport and deported him without any due process whatsoever. So that was it.
And where was he deported to?
To Liberia, back to his home country, which was then, just coming out of a civil war. So, but whatever the case, they still decided to take him there. And the reasons given then, by the government was that he violated immigration rules or whatever. That was the reason they've given. But they never kind of underwent any due process whatsoever before they got him deported.
So he was not charged with any offense or tried before any court for these alleged offenses he committed?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think he was ever charged with anything, because before you charge somebody, I think you take them before a court. He wasn't taken before a court. He was just taken to the airport and deported.
Do you know if he was given any access to lawyers or consular services since he was from a foreign country?
Again, I'm not aware of him getting access to either consular services or legal, advice or whatever. As far as we know, they handled it on their own. They took him straight to the airport and deported him.
And you mentioned that he was sent back to a country from where he fled to seek refuge in the Gambia.
That's true. Liberia was then coming out of civil war, and it was still a dangerous place to be in, particularly for a journalist.
And after his deportation, what happened to the newspaper after that? He was the owner and the MD, as you said.
Yes, the newspaper continued, even though there was a lot of harassment from the authorities, but we insisted that we were going to continue the newspaper. Mr. Theophilus George, as a Gambian who was appointed as the managing director, he was appointed by Mr. Best himself to become the managing director. And those of us who were left at the Observer, we did everything under very difficult circumstances to continue to ensure that the paper survives.
And who was Mr. Theophilus George?
Theophilus George was, well, I knew him as a teacher at one time because he was my teacher at college, at the Yundum College. But he was also involved in publishing, and I think he was working for Macmillan publication or something. And so that was Theophilus George, and he was appointed as the managing director of the paper.
You mentioned difficult circumstances that you had to work under after Mr. Best left the country. Can you just elaborate more on that?
Yes, after the deportation of Mr. Best, we were constantly being raided by immigration officers coming to the Observer, checking on the, the immigration credentials of, most of the non-Gambian staff who were working there. It was so routine. Almost on a daily basis, they were coming there. Eventually, they even had to position, to appoint, to post somebody permanently at the Observer gate from the immigration department who would check on the credentials of anybody who goes into the Observer or comes out of the Observer. So, there was a lot of pressure from the authorities on the Daily Observer.
And what was the effect of having that immigration officer at the door of the Observer newspaper checking on immigration credentials of non-Gambian staff?
Well, it has very negative effect, particularly on the non-Gambian staff here. Most of them became so edgy, some of them would even avoid coming to the Observer if they can. So, it wasn't easy with them at all.
And after Mr. Best left the country, you mentioned that there were a number of foreign members of staff at the Observer. Did anything happen to them? Yes,
some of them were deported, of course. I can cite the cases of Rodney Sieh, for instance. He was a nephew to Mr. Best himself, a Liberian journalist. He was then the sports editor of the Daily Observer. He was eventually deported. I don't know exactly what he was charged with, but again, he was also not given, the due process going before the courts or whatever. He was just unceremoniously deported. Then, we had other deportations as well. I remember one Cherno Ojuku Sise was a Sierra Leonean journalist who was also deported. I think it was 1996 that he was deported. Again, he wasn't given any due process in the deportation. It was arbitrary. Others also were deported. I know of one Sule Musa, a Nigerian journalist also. In the case of Sule Musa, what happened was, I think it was when the former Nigerian dictator Sani Abacha died. Sule Musa was one of those who was actually jubilating about his death. And then, we know that the government, especially former President Jammeh, was very close to Sani Abacha. And again, the Nigerian High Commissioner in this country then was also very close to the government. I think he was called Tenelabe or something. I cannot now remember the exact name, but he was very also close to the government, and we understand he was the one who, actually was behind Sule Musa's deportation. So others also were deported. I know. There was this Mohamed Mboyo. He's a Congolese journalist who was also freelancing with the Daily Observer. He was deported. There was also this Nigerian journalist, Chikeluba Kenechukwu. He was also deported. Then I remember at one time 2 other members of staff. That is Moko Makoli. He was a young reporter, a Liberian, and also Pa Winton. I think he was working for the technical department of the Daily Observer. On the same day, they too were also deported. I remember them being taken to the immigration. I went there trying to talk to the immigration director then, who was Naisise, but to no avail. I couldn't stop their deportation, and they were deported. I'm sure I cannot remember all the names, but some other people were deported as well. Yeah.
Were there other nationalities? For example, was there a Ghanaian national who was deported?
Yes, I remember. We have Elikot Said, who was a Ghanaian national, who was editor-in-chief at one time. He was deported in 1997 to Ghana. Yeah.
And all these deportations that you mentioned, under what circumstances were they done?
Well, most of them were quite arbitrarily done. Again, there was no due process, like taking them to court, whatever, it wasn't done in most of these cases, or rather in all of these cases. Everything was so arbitrarily done. Just pick them from their homes or wherever, maybe take them straight to the airport, or, detain them for a while and then deport them. That was the case, yeah.
Do you know if there was any particular reason why the foreign staff at Observer newspaper were being targeted?
Yeah, I think the intention was, they wanted to cripple the Daily Observer. They had the impression that probably these non-Gambian journalists were the people, behind the continuation of the Daily Observer. They probably thought that if they can clear these foreign journalists out of the Daily Observer, then the paper will just close down. That's the impression they had. But we, the Gambian staff, we made sure that the paper survived no matter what happened. Yeah.
Did any of the non-foreign staff remain after all these deportations?
Well, some tried to hang on, but at the end of the day, very, very few of them, if any, was ever left there. The paper virtually moved into Gambian hands, and we took charge of the paper, and everything was working well. Even though the press was still continued from the authorities, but we still insisted on. In fact, at one time, I can remember when news broke out that Kenneth Best has sold the paper to Amadou Samba in 1999, we were very much disappointed. We, the Gambian staff, most of us were let down because, after all that we've gone through to ensure the survival of the paper, here was Mr. Best. Without consulting with us, he went and sold the paper to somebody close to the regime. So we were really let down. Yeah.
Apart from the deportations, do you know of any other circumstances where foreign staff actually left employment of the Daily Observer newspaper?
Yes, of course. Some of the non-Gambian reporters or journalists left on their own accord because the pressure was just too much on them. I remember, for instance, there was this Sierra Leonean journalist, Justice Fofana, and I also remember there was an Englishman there who was an editor. He was called David Somers, and a lot of other people also. They had to leave on their own accord because the pressure they were getting from the authorities was too much, and they just couldn't bear it any longer.
You mentioned Justice Fofana from Sierra Leone. For example, do you know of any personal experience he had that led him to leave the country?
I do not have the details, but I know Justice Fofana has been arrested on a few occasions as well, while he was working with the Daily Observer. So that maybe was enough to hound him out of the country. Yeah.
And what about David Summers?
David Summers, as far as I know, he was not arrested. Well, I wasn't aware of his arrest, but he appears he was not also very comfortable the way the authorities were, piling pressure on the Daily Observer, so he had to quit.
Do you remember a journalist called Pascal Eze from Nigeria?
Yes, I remember Pascal Eze. At one time, he became editor-in-chief of the Daily Observer, and he eventually also had to leave. I think for him, he wasn't happy because the way that the Observer management was handling situation there, because after the selling of the Observer to Amadou Samba, things started to turn not very comfortable for some of the professional reporters, because they were not having it the way they wanted to. There was too much pressure on them to handle the news in a particular way, and some of them were not happy with that. Pascal Eze, I guess, was one of those people, and he decided to quit as a result of that.
From your narrations, it would seem that only the foreign staff or non-Gambian staff were being targeted. Is that correct?
No, not really. I mean, maybe they were a most softer target because, being non-Gambians. But definitely, everybody who worked at the Observer then, was not having it easy. There were occasions when, people were arrested and detained for one thing or the other. For instance, we had this a reporter called Abdullah Savage, who was then, who went to the the army barracks, the Fajara barracks, when during the November 11, so-called attempted coup. He went there to try and get more information, and he was seriously brutalized by the soldiers there, and they even, I think, destroyed his equipment or whatever, his recorder and camera and everything, and he sustained some injuries as well. He was a Gambian, and there are also many other Gambians who also had suffered, similar fates, not for anything else, but because they were working for the Observer, probably.
You mentioned that the staff at the Daily Observer were under pressure. Can you just elaborate more on that? Where was the pressure coming from?
Well, obviously from the authorities. What happened was the Daily Observer was, it was the biggest newspaper in this country. It had a lot of influence on, on Gambians, news-wise, and also non-Gambians. Most non-Gambians and Gambians relied on the Daily Observer for what was happening in this country. But because they were not just towing the line of the authorities then, they were writing, giving the opportunity to others also to write their opinions, on the paper. The government didn't like that. Probably they wanted somebody just to sing their praises. But the Observer was not willing to do that because, they were professionals and trying to do things in a professional way. And that didn't please the government. So that was the reason why they were piling a lot of pressure on the Daily Observer. Probably the intention, their ultimate objective was to get the paper, folded up, which they tried everything they could, but it didn't work.
You mentioned change of management from Kenneth Best to Amadou Samba. And you also mentioned the relationship between Amadou Samba and the head of state. Can you tell us if there was any pressure coming from Amadou Samba?
Not that I'm aware of Amadou Samba personally putting any pressure, but I think there was a general impression, that Amadou Samba was kind of a front, but the actual owner of the Daily Observer was Yaya Jammeh. Well, that was the impression some people had, because we knew that definitely some of the pressure coming from on the Daily Observer was being orchestrated from higher up, not from Amadou Samba, but probably from the State House or from President Jammeh himself. So, that was the situation.
And if that was the case, that the former president, Yaya Jammeh, actually owned the Observer newspaper, would it then be the case that he was actually controlling the paper as owner?
Well, of course, it eventually became so obvious that, the paper was being controlled from State House, because eventually he was the one who was appointing, the managing directors and the editors-in-chief and other things. So they were directly being appointed from State House. So that was it. So the indication was there that Amadou was just a front, but he was not the actual owner of the Daily Observer.
Apart from the Gambian nationals that you mentioned who were harassed and intimidated by the authorities, can you, you mentioned one Mr. Abdallah Savage. Can you think of any other people who suffered his fate?
Yeah, I think virtually everybody who worked at the Daily Observer at one time or the other must have had a brush with, the authorities. Either you are detained, you are kind of threatened or given a warning or whatever, from the authorities. But in specific cases, for instance, I remember in 1998, the Weekend Observer then, which was the weekend edition of the Daily Observer, carried a story about the collapse of a part of the wall of the State House. Our reporter, who happened to be there at that very moment, witnessed it, came there in the morning and saw that part of the wall has collapsed after a rainstorm. And inside the State House were parked some armored cars. Well, that was an interesting story. He wrote the story, he published it, and then that put us in trouble. I think the Weekend Observer came out on a Friday. Then the following Sunday, when we went to work to prepare for the Monday paper, some NIA operatives came there. Myself, Dr. Deyda Hydara, and the author of the article, Giran Senghor, were picked up and taken to the NIA. Yeah.
Before we go into your ordeal at the NIA, can I just take you back to some of the complaints you received as GPU president from journalists who had actually had their human rights violated at some point or the other?
Well, yes, as GPU president, definitely I've been receiving quite a lot of complaints from journalists, because virtually on a weekly basis, journalists were in trouble with the authorities, one thing or the other. So you can imagine, as the president of the Gambia Press Union, everybody would be, coming to the union to lay their complaint, one thing or the other. And we were trying everything we could under very difficult circumstances, because then the GPU was not as endowed as it is today. We didn't have money, we didn't have a lot of other facilities as well. But it wasn't easy, and that was the situation then.
Did any particular cases stand out to you?
Yes, I remember, when the Independent was set up, Dr. Deyda Hydara and Deyda Hydara, who were co-proprietors of the paper, they were at one time picked up, and then, because their citizenship was being questioned, that was the reason why they were arrested. And there were a lot of other occasions. For example, Pap Sen and Deyda also suffered similar fates. They were their, their citizenship was also being questioned, and they had brush with the authorities on that issue. And a lot of other issues that were happening to journalists for one reason or the other. So all these things were being reported and being handled by the GPU.
Any experience with broadcast journalists working in radio stations?
Yeah, well, yes, of course. Then at that time, we didn't have many radio stations as we have today. But we had Radio 1 FM, we had Citizen FM, and I cannot remember any other station at that time when I was president of the GPU. But I know, Radio 1 FM, there was an attempt to burn down the Radio 1 FM at one time. That was in 2001. And the proprietor, George Christensen, had even suffered some burns as a result of trying to put out the fire when it was attacked. And one of his reporters also, that is Aliou Ba, I think prior to the attempt to burn down or after, I cannot get the sequence of events, but actually there was an attempt to firebomb his house as well while he was sleeping inside there. Then, Citizen FM also has been having a lot of problems with the authorities. At one time, it was forcibly closed down, and the proprietor Babukar Gay and Ibrahim Asila were arrested, for one thing or the other. So we've been having a lot of problems with the authorities with regards to all the media houses virtually.
You mentioned a few arson attacks on these journalists. Do you know if complaints were made to the authorities, and if so, if they did anything about it?
Well, of course, every time there was an arson attack or any other attack on a media house, complaints were, just as a formality, were made. But we never expected the authorities to act because we expect them to have sanctioned those attacks. So virtually nothing was ever done about all those arson attacks. Yeah.
You've mentioned various forms of harassment and intimidation from the authorities to journalists. Have you had a complaint of torture?
Oh, yes. Yes, we've been having complaints of torture. People have been arrested and they claim to have been tortured. For instance, there was this editor-in-chief of the Independent, Ablai C. He was once arrested and detained at the NIA. We did everything as GPU to try to get to him, but every time we went, they said they didn't have him. So we had to eventually go to the court and try to get him to. But even while the court process was on, they released him. And he told us that, well, he was not physically tortured, but he was put in a very dark cell called Bambadinka or whatever, and it was not comfortable to be there, with the mosquitoes and everything else. There were other occasions as well where journalists have claimed torture. But most of the time, it was later when I had already left the GPU that these torture cases became more rampant actually.
Apart from the torture, were there other forms of violations?
Well, of course, virtually everything they were doing, like just taking somebody from their home and deporting them to their own country was a violation. And there were a lot of other violations as well. People, would go for coverages and then, they were either harassed or, had their equipment seized or destroyed or whatever, Those were all occasions of violation and they were very frequent.
You mentioned Deyda Hydara. Can you tell us what happened to him?
Yes, Deyda Hydara in 2004, he was killed. He was shot dead by drive-by shooting. That was on the 13th anniversary of the point. He had a ceremony at the point with his staff, and he was then in the evening when they finished the ceremony. He decided to drop some of his staff to their homes because it was getting late. And while he was driving home, just by the Kanifing Sangkung Silak Junction, he just scuffed in there trying to get inside. When I think some people in a taxi, as I understand, followed them, and they came by his side. He was driving the car, and they shot him. So that was it. And he eventually died. Yeah.
And were the identities of the perpetrators ever revealed?
Well, we've been hearing all kinds of rumors, all kinds of names have been, but the government never did any serious investigation on the matter. I can recall, I think in 2005 or 2006, there was this report released by the NIA, but instead of doing any serious investigation of the matter, they kind of were disparaging Deyda, calling him all kinds of names and even accusing him of being a womanizer. Probably somebody shot him because he was he had a girlfriend who's all kinds of things. So they were putting the blame on Deyda for him being killed instead of trying to seriously investigate the case.
Do you know if the authorities made any particular statements about his death, official statements?
Well, that was the only statement that I'm aware of. That the NIA, the NIA really issued a release. That was in 2005 or 2006. I can't remember exactly, but they issued this release about his death. And but as I said, the blame was virtually on him, rather than on trying to give us as the reason as to why anybody would kill him. Yeah.
Did the former president, D.A Jawo, make any remarks about Deyda Hydara's death?
Yes, I know for one thing, every time the issue of Deyda was raised, the government felt very uncomfortable. I remember at one time, on the first anniversary of his death, the GPU decided to organize a commemoration of, to kind of observe the event. And we invited journalists from the sub-region. That is, we held this at Kairaba. At the end of the ceremony, we decided to visit the site where he was killed. When we went near there, we found heavily armed, paramilitary police standing there, and they said they wouldn't allow us to get in there. We tried to find out why. They said they got the order from above that they should not allow anybody to get in there. So every time there was this Deyda issue was mentioned, the government was not. Again, I remember, I think shortly after his killing, I think the 7th day or whatever, the GPU wanted to organize a march, just to show how concerned we were about the security of journalists. Initially, the authorities refused to allow the march. They refused to, give us permit to do the march. But after some discussions with them, we were allowed to go ahead with the march, but with certain conditions. And one of those conditions was that only journalists were to take part in the march and nobody else. And we were also to follow a certain route, that is from the arch to, because we were presenting some petitions to the Inspector General of Police and the Minister of the Interior. So we were allowed to march on that route to those places as well. So, we had no choice. We had to go ahead with that condition. We went ahead and marched. But despite that, there was so many, armed soldiers on both sides of the road while we were marching. So, you see, you can see that the Deyda issue definitely was not a comfortable issue for them, for the government. And they would do everything. Well, to go back to your question, I think it was 2009, President Jammeh used to have this annual interview he used to give to GRTS. And on this particular occasion, he was asked a question about Deyda Hydara. And he made quite, I don't know how he framed it, but definitely it was not a nice thing. I think he said, whoever wanted to know who killed Deyda, go and ask him. And also he said that Deyda, was not more important than people who die on road accidents on a daily basis. So, GPU were not happy with such a statement. And the president of the GPU, that is Deyda Hydara, who happened to, was out of the country then, she was in Mali because she was then doing some work for the West Africa Journalists Association. So she issued a press release on the matter, you know. I mean, and then some newspapers, most of the newspapers actually decided to carry that statement, but that put them in trouble. Well, she was lucky, she was out of the country, but those who were in the country, I mean, like the editors of those newspapers, as well as some senior officers of the GPU, were rounded up, you know, detained, eventually, you know, taken to court and even convicted.
Can you tell us what the press statement said?
Yeah, I mean, the press statement was kind of putting GPU's position on the issue. You know, they were not happy with what the president had said, you know, about Deyda, and so they were. That was it. That was the press statement. That was, because it's a tradition that every time press is, I mean, media issues are, I mean, involved, the GPU would put its position on the table. You know, they would issue, because they speak on behalf of journalists. So they decided to issue a press release on this issue, you know, criticizing the president for making such a statement about Deyda. And that was what the government was not, I didn't like. And the newspapers that went ahead and published that thing also were in trouble. Those were the people who were arrested.
What about the petition you say was made to the IGP and Minister of Interior? What was that petition about?
Well, as I said, we were concerned about the safety of journalists after the killing of Deyda Hydara. So we wanted to put that to the authorities, that we wanted them to, you know, to give us more security as journalists in this country. You know, that was the petition we wrote both to the IGP and to the Minister of the Interior.
Did the petition also ask for an investigation to be launched into Deyda Hydara's death?
Oh yes, we constantly kept on reminding, you know, the authorities that there was need to investigate the case. We even suggested to the authorities that, you know, I mean, we felt that the Gambian security forces did not have the capacity to investigate such a case, so they should involve outsiders, for example, the FBI of the USA, I mean, and also maybe the UK investigating authorities and others, probably even Senegal, you know, people who have the capacity to help our, I mean, security forces to investigate the case, but they always turned it down.
Do you know if there was any possibility of these foreign agencies you mentioned actually helping the Gambia? Was there any offer made, for example? I mean, what was the possibility of that happening?
I cannot remember now whether there was any offer made from outside, but we always, I mean, press on the government to ask for, I mean, foreign assistance on this case, which they always turned down.
So you're saying that they never made any approach to these foreign agencies for assistance to investigate the case?
Yeah, I think at one time, I cannot remember who it is, but there was talk about, you know, them asking for somebody from outside. Was it ECOWAS? Was it the FBI? I cannot now remember. But I think there was one, you know, it was being kind of metered somewhere, but I don't think it ever materialized.
As far as you know, was there a proper investigation launched into the death of Deyda Hydara?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There was no proper investigation, you know, I mean, on the case. No doubt about that, yeah. I remember, you know, I mean, well, you know, there were two ladies in Deyda's care who were also injured in the process when he was being shot. You know, those two ladies were admitted at the emergency ward of the RVTH. And but we were not happy the way they were being treated in this country. So we made arrangements to transfer them to Dakar to get proper treatment. In fact, I was the one who accompanied them to Dakar. And they were admitted in a hospital in Dakar where they got the treatment. But we always asked the government to ensure that, you know, a proper investigation was done in place. Then when they set up the NIA set up a committee, they said who were investigating the case. They went to Dakar, interviewed those two ladies, and they even called me at one time at the NIA asking me questions about Deyda's case. But as far as we understand, they were not very serious about investigating the case. In fact, we told the people, I mean, we told the authorities that maybe the best way to go about investigating the case is to give the family the autopsy report, as well as the bullets that were removed from Deyda's body. But up to this very day, the family has asked for those things. They were never given access to those. Neither the autopsy report nor the bullets that were taken out from his body, because we thought probably if the family had access to those things, then they can be able to get their own private investigator to look at those things. But it never happened.
And do you know where these the autopsy report as well as the bullets, do you know under whose custody they are right now?
We have no idea where they are. I mean, I know the autopsy, I understand, was carried out by one Dr. Njai Pacha, they used to call him. He was a military doctor at one time. But what has happened to the autopsy report and the bullets, we have no idea.
And to date, has this particular case, the death of Deyda Hydara, do you know if it has actually been solved?
No, as far as I'm aware, I mean, there was no investigation done, and the case is still pending. I mean, we have no idea as to who is responsible for his death. You know, I mean, as I said, names have been mentioned from time to time. You know, recently, for example, we heard about the new government mentioning certain names like Bombardier and Sana Manjang and whatever, you know, but, well, I don't think anything was ever, you know, anything substantive was ever done as yet on this matter. So we are hoping and praying that maybe somebody who knows exactly what has happened will appear before the TRRC and tell us the facts. That's what we are all praying for anyway.
You mentioned Dr. Pacha Njai. Was he a pathologist, as far as you know?
I'm not sure about his exact qualification, but I understand he's a medical doctor. And I guess probably he was a pathologist. That's why he did the autopsy. I don't know.
That is just an assumption you're making.
Yeah, it is. I don't know exactly what his specialties are.
Thank you. You mentioned these two ladies. Are you in a position to mention who they are?
Yes, one of them is called Deyda Jawo. She's currently in the United States. And there is also Nyang Sana Job. She used to work for The Point. I don't know whether she is still there.
And where is she now?
I know she's in this country, but whether she's still at The Point, I'm not very sure. Recently, actually, I met up with her. She's around anyway.
And do you know whether these two particular ladies had any redress or remedy after they were injured as a result of the assassination of Deyda Hydara?
Well, the only remedy that I know of, that, you know, we made everything possible to transfer them to Dakar, and they were, you know, admitted in a hospital and given very good treatment, and, you know, they're out now. They're well, okay, as far as those injuries are concerned. But whether they ever had any kind of remedy or compensation, I'm not aware of that.
Do you know if they filed any complaints, for example, to the authorities?
I'm not sure whether they formally filed any complaints whatsoever, because when I took them over there, Ida never actually stepped foot in this country again. You know, she was in Dakar for a while until she eventually got, you know, placement somewhere, and she was taken to the United States. But Nyang Sara decided to come back home. She's right now home, but I'm not aware of any formal complaint that was, put to the authorities.
Would you be surprised to know that Mr. Pachanjai is not a pathologist?
I would be surprised, because I think probably, you know, autopsies are done by pathologists. That's what I expect, you know, but I don't know.
Very well. Can we just go back to the arrest and detention of journalists after the press release was done on Deyda Hydara's, on the remarks that President Jammeh made on the death of Deyda Hydara? And can you just tell us who you know was arrested at that point?
I know Pap Sen, who is the managing editor of The Point, was one of them. I know Sam Sar, editor-in-chief of the Foria, was one of them. I know Emil Toure, the former president of the GPU, was one of them. Pamodu Fall, who was then working with The Point, was one of them. And then you had Sarata Jabi, who was also working with The Point, who was actually suckling a young baby, and she was arrested with the baby as well. And I cannot remember who else was involved, but these people I know were part of it.
Do you know how they were arrested and where they were detained?
I may not be in a position to know exactly because I was then out of the country. I was in Dakar at the time they were arrested. I was just following the case on the news as well, but I didn't have more details as to. But I know eventually they were charged with sedition or something. Yeah.
Would you do you know if they were actually charged with treason?
Not treason. I don't think treason was part of the charge. I think sedition was the charge. I may be wrong because I wasn't around, but I don't think they went to the point of charging them with treason, no.
And what happened to Deyda Hydara, if you know?
Well, she was lucky to have been out of their reach. She was in Mali then. But, well, she eventually got into more trouble, not as a result of that thing, but I think she was a member of another civic organization called CCG, that's Change for, I don't know what it means, Gambia or something. And, you know, I mean, if you recall, there was this arrest of Dr. Amadou Skatrit Jane, you know, and I think she was also implicated on that particular case, and she was eventually charged with treason. But fortunately for her, she was out of their reach. Yeah.
What about the particular incident where you say the journalists were tried for sedition? Was she actually charged with them? Do you know?
I'm not sure, but well, she was the author of the that press release that actually put those journalists in trouble. So I would assume that she was also charged, but she wasn't around. Yeah.
And did she eventually go in exile? Was she?
Well,
exiled?
she was out of the country, and she decided to stay in Mali in exile because it was definitely not safe for her to come over at that period. Yeah.
So she was not that lucky, because you mentioned that she was lucky, but she was exiled.
Well, but that's right. On that aspect, yeah, she was lucky that she didn't fall into their hands. But, well, exile is another issue altogether, yeah.
Okay, very well. Mr. Chairman, we have a few minutes left, so I don't know if you would like me to continue with the witness, because we're going into a major area, which is his personal detention, arrest and detention at the NIA, which will take quite some time. So in terms of just managing this whole testimony, it might be better to start that new topic tomorrow, because we have a session tomorrow for the witness.
Oh, splendid. If we have a session tomorrow, you can finish your questioning now, and if the commissioners have any questions to put, perhaps we can do that, or if you think that we should hold our questions until tomorrow, you give us some guidance on that.
If the chairman and commissioners don't mind, I'll proceed now until around 4:30 and then continue tomorrow, if that's okay.
Fine, that's okay with me. You please go on. Go ahead. Go continue.
All right, very well. Mr. Witness, can I just take you back? You mentioned when you were arrested together with some of your colleagues as a result of that newspaper report on the State House. If you could just elaborate more on that, tell us who you were arrested with and when you were arrested. and where you were taken to?
Well, we were arrested on the following Sunday. As I said, we had this Weekend Observer, which was published on the 28th, which I guess was on a Friday. And then the following Sunday, we went to work to produce the Monday paper. And it was at the premises of the Observer that we were arrested. I was arrested together with Dr. D.A Jawo, who was then the editor-in-chief of the Daily Observer, and Giran Senghor, who was the reporter actually who wrote that story. So this time round, when they came, it was only Babagale and myself who were at the Observer then. Giran wasn't there. I don't know where they picked him later, but two of us were taken to the NIA, and we were taken in different, pickups. Actually, there's a group of NIA operatives who came. I only knew one of them, and that was Baba Saho. I think he was a senior officer of the NIA then. Yeah.
Can you describe the pickup trucks that actually picked you and the others?
All I can say that they were pickup trucks, but honestly, I cannot even remember the color or the makeup or whatever, because it's been quite a long time. Yeah.
And how many people picked you up?
Again, I'm not in a position to remember the number of people, but I know in the car that I was, I think there were 3 of them in there. I don't know Babagale's pickup, but in my own, we had the driver and 2 other people with me there.
And you can confirm that these were NIA officers?
Well, I'm almost certain that they were NIA. Well, there was nothing to indicate that they were NIA officers, because when they came, they didn't even tell me who they were. All they said, they wanted us, wanted me to go with them. They didn't even tell me what they wanted me for or what they accused me of, except one of them said they had that we were keeping arms in the Observer, and they, that was the reason why they came there. I thought that was a big joke, because we had nothing to do with arms whatsoever. It is only when we arrived at the NIA that I had an idea as to why we were taken there in the first place.
Did they make any search at your office for these arms they claimed they were looking for?
I cannot remember them making any search whatsoever. I think that was just another pretext, but honestly, I cannot remember them making any search whatsoever.
And you say they did not identify themselves? They did not show you any warrant cards or anything like that?
No, certainly no. There was no warrant card whatsoever. Of course, I think they said they were from the office of the president, but again, they were not very specific as to who they were.
So you got into the pickup trucks, and where did you go?
Well, we headed straight to Banjul, and when we arrived at the NIA head office on Marina Parade, they got in, and as soon as we arrived in the NIA offices, we alighted, and they took me to an office. Yeah.
Can you tell us which office they took you to?
As I say, it's been quite a long time now. I cannot even remember the location of the office, but I know it's somewhere on the left-hand side when you enter the NIA premises. And I think it was the office of Baba Saho, because, he sat on the desk and he was very comfortable in that office. So I think that was his office. Yeah.
Apart from Baba Saho, did you recognize any other people at the NIA when you got there?
No, not that on that very day, no, I didn't recognize any one of the others who were there, no.
And at the time, who was the director of the NIA?
It was Daba Marena who was the director general, yeah.
Did you see him at any point during your detention at the NIA?
Well, I only saw him on the second day, when we were being released. That was the time, he and one other senior official, Fode Barry, invited us, and we sat with them, and they gave us some kind of counseling and advice. That was the only time I saw him.
Before we go into that, let's just go back to what happened to you after you were taken to the office, which you suspect to be Baba Saho's office. What happened to you after you were taken there?
Well, it was there that I had an idea as to why I was taken there in the first place. Because, while we were sitting down, they brought a copy of the Weekend Observer, with that story on the collapse of the State House wall. And they started asking me questions on that particular story. So that was the very moment I knew that maybe this is the reason why I'm brought here.
But apart from that, did they actually tell you why you had been arrested and brought to the NIA?
No, they never told me anything, except when they started questioning me on that story. Then, that was indirectly telling me that this is the reason why I was brought there. But they never formally told me that we have brought you here in connection with this story. But the questioning was based on that story.
Before they started questioning you, did they caution you about your rights?
No, I was never cautioned about anything. All they did was they brought out the paper, started asking me questions, eventually gave me, a questionnaire, handwritten questionnaire, and then wanted me to answer to fill those questions.
Did they tell you that you had the right to a lawyer, for example?
No, they never told me that.
Can you tell us what the questionnaire was all about?
Well, I remember the questions were mainly, they wanted me to tell them who I am, what my name is, where I, originated from, who my close friends are, what political party I belong to, things of that nature. Yeah.
And what did that have to do with the reason why you were there, in your opinion?
I have no idea what connection it has with that story that we published. Honestly, I didn't.
Kindly just continue and tell us the other questions they asked about this particular article that was published.
Yeah, for them, it was a kind of a breach of peace, because as far as they are concerned, we should never have carried that story. For them, it was a security issue. We have seen these armored vehicles. Our reporter has seen those armored vehicles parked in the State House. We should never have mentioned that they were there. For them, it was a security question, and we have violated the whatever law they thought we violated.
Did they charge you?
No, we were never charged with anything. We were detained for 2 nights, and the following day, the Director General and this 4-day barrack called us, chatted with us, advised us to be careful of what we wrote next time, and then we were allowed to go without any charge whatsoever.
Where were you detained?
I personally was detained in an office, in the NIA, right by the sea. Right by the sea there, with all the windows glasses were broken, and you can imagine the mosquitoes that were there at night. It was horrible.
Please tell us what your experience was on that night with the mosquitoes.
Well, honestly, sleeping was out of the question. There was no way that anybody could sleep under such a condition when mosquitoes were all over my body. The following day, my whole body was itching as if I had some skin disease or whatever. That was the situation, and I had to spend 2 nights in that particular. There was no, the warder came and pointed at some wooden bench, and he said, "You can lie on that one." That is exactly where. When I wanted to drink, he pointed at the toilet. He said, "There is a sink there. You can drink from there." And that was it. It was not a nice experience at all.
What about food and water? Was that provided? Sorry, food.
Well, food. In the evening, the first night, maybe around 7 or so, a warder came and told me that he was giving $5 to buy me something to eat. What do I need? you know, I didn't know what to tell him. And then he suggested bread and butter. I said, well, okay. Do you want tea? I say, if I can get coffee, I would prefer that. Then he brought me half a loaf of bread and butter, and then, you know, some coffee, you know, a sachet of coffee, and water, hot water, and a cup. Well, he brought sugar, I guess, but he never brought any spoon whatsoever. And I had a pen, so I had to use that pen to actually, you know, stir the sugar and the coffee to be able to drink it. But, well, I tried to eat, but it wasn't easy, definitely not.
So this was the first night?
Yeah, well, that was the first night. And the second night, you know, similar situation. Honestly, I never had any solid food while I was there.
And you say you also did not sleep because of the mosquitoes.
Yeah,
you were
of course.
busy driving them off your body.
Of course, it was impossible to sleep under such a situation.
You've already mentioned that you were not given access to a lawyer whilst you were detained. Did you have access to anyone else, like your family?
No, I had no access to anybody outside of that place. And even my colleagues, Baba Gale and Giran, I never saw them until when we were being released. That was the time I saw them. I didn't know which part of the NIA they were detained.
And do you know if anything happened to them?
Not that I'm aware of. Well, personally, I was not physically tortured, and I expect my colleagues were also not physically tortured. But I'm not sure what happened, because as I say, I never saw them until when we were being released.
And would you consider being at the NIA for almost 48 hours without sleep, drinking toilet water, and being attacked by all the mosquitoes in Banjul? Would you consider that a form of torture?
Well, of course it is torture. I mean, it's not physical torture, but certainly it's both psychological and whatever kind of, but it's torture, whatever form you want to call it, yeah.
So you were actually tortured, but not physically?
Not physically, yes, but certainly I consider this, you know, putting me in that situation where I just cannot sleep. I mean, it was definitely torture, yeah.
Apart from, you know, being sleep deprived, what about the general atmosphere of being at the NIA premises, considering what had happened to colleagues of yours, for example, stories that you heard, and once you've narrated, I mean, how did you feel being there, not knowing what was going to happen to you?
It was not a pleasant experience whatsoever. You know, just being isolated in that place, not having an idea as to how long you're going to stay there. I mean, your family not having an idea what situation you are in. I think it wasn't quite a pleasant experience. So, and nobody would want to undergo such a situation. Definitely not.
You mentioned that you were questioned. Did you take a statement, or did they take a statement from you?
Not exact. I mean, apart from those questions that they wanted me to answer, you know, I answered them as much as I could, and then they asked me to sign underneath, and I did. That was it.
So the answers to your questions were being recorded?
Oh, yes, on the sheet of paper that they gave me, yes.
Is it the same sheet of paper that had the questionnaire about your tribe and political affiliations?
Exactly. That's the sheet of paper I'm talking about. You know, everything was recorded on that sheet of paper, yes.
And kindly just tell us what happened after you were detained at the NIA. You were eventually released. Is that correct?
Yes, on the second day, you know, I was eventually released, and I went home and, well, continued life as usual, you know, began going to the Observer again, doing the work I'm supposed to be doing, yeah.
And that was after you had been cautioned by Dava Marena and Fude Barry to make sure you don't report anything that you're not supposed to.
Exactly, that was it. You know, I mean, they gave us that pep talk there, and urging us to be careful about what we report about, and that was it. Yeah. Apart
from your arrest and detention at the NIA on that particular occasion, did you suffer any personal intimidation or harassment or threats at any other occasions?
Yes. Well, I remember in August 2004, early in the morning, my wife picked up an envelope or a note that was addressed to me, and she handed over. I think somebody from outside must have dropped it in the compound, and then she handed it to me. When I read it, I saw that it was a note coming from a group of people who were claiming to be supporters of President Yahya Jammeh. So, they threatened, that they were going to teach me a lesson because of the criticisms that I was doing to the president. And, they said a lot of other things. I cannot remember exactly what it is now. But anyway, they made a threat to me, and they even promised that, they were going to teach one of my journalists. I was the president of the GPU, and they threatened that one of my journalists will be taught a lesson which they hope will be, kind of act as a lesson to me and everybody else. So that was it.
And do you have a copy of this note?
Unfortunately, what happened was that when I received that note, I had to go and report to the Inspector General of Police. I took the note there. That was, then it was 13 Baji. I cannot remember his first name was, but we used to call him 13 Baji. He was the Inspector General of Police. And then he asked me to leave the note with him. They were going to investigate the matter. And that was the last time I saw that note. Even though, I wrote down exactly what was on the note. And I do not have access to my statement right now, but it's definitely there as well.
Yes, you have provided the record of what that note said. And if you don't mind, I can read it to you so you can confirm if this was what was written on the note.
Right.
It says, "Dear D.A Jawo, your writings against President Yahya Jammeh and Gambia generally, SIC, full stop, we have noticed that you are always happy to go hard on our good president and the work that he is doing. Your constant ranting and lies about development in the Gambia speak volumes of your character as the enemy of truth. No right-thinking Gambian would say that Gambia has not seen development since His Excellency took over power in 1994. But idiots like you are agents of the West, and we are closing our nets on you. Very soon, we will teach one of your journalists a very good lesson so that all of you will learn one or two things from him. We have laid our lives for this revolution, and therefore we will not allow rats like you to spoil the good gains that we have already made. We know where you are staying, in Kanifing Housing Estate. We therefore warn you in advance to calm down, or we will tame you. I am sure you do not want your bones and flesh to be thrown to dogs and vultures. Peace in the defense of the revolution, ! ×3. Is that what the note you received said?
Yes, exactly. That's the note that was handed over to me.
And would you consider that as a death threat?
Well, it was a threat anyway. Whether it was to the extent of killing me, well, they're speaking about taking my bones and other things, so it could definitely tantamount to a death threat as well.
Indeed. Apart from this particular note and the threat you received through the note, were there any other instances where you received death threats?
Well, on this particular note first, because they have also promised that they were going to teach one of my journalists a lesson. And on that very month in August, later on, Ibrahim Asila, who was then the BBC correspondent in this country, as well as the current Minister of Information, had his house. There was an attempt to burn down his house while he was sleeping in there. He was living in Jambur, his home village. So he was lucky to have jumped through the window to escape being burnt. So, when I heard that news, I thought probably this is the lesson they were talking about. But later on, in December of that same year, Deyda Hydara was shot and killed. So you see, again, probably it was one of the lessons they were talking about. With regards to other maybe threats on me, I remember, I can't now remember the year. Probably it was early in 2004. But I was in Kanilai on attending a seminar there with some people. I can't remember again who organized that seminar, but I was in Kanilai and we were staying at Sindola Hotel. Then I again remember there was Major Khalifa Bajinka, who was I think the head of the presidential guard in Kanilai then. I remember him coming. We were then having dinner at the restaurant there. He came there with a group of soldiers, We came to the table I was, and greeted me and we shook hands. I had no idea whether there was anything cooking. It was maybe not long after that, there was this report on the Gambia Echo, which is an online newspaper. It was run by Ibrahim Sankare, who is the present government spokesperson. The story didn't quote anybody in particular, It was referring to anonymous sources, but talking about an attempt to get me killed then. And it was said that Bajinka was supposed to lead these people to identify me, and then they will take me away. And I have no idea whether it was just speculative or the truth, but that was it, and that was the story. Yeah.
And according to the story, Major Bajinka was supposed to identify you to whom?
Well, the people who were supposed to kill me, well, some security forces, but I understand somebody told me that he said he didn't want me dead, so he told them that, I wasn't there. So that was it. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, one thing I know, years after, that was in 2015, I met Bajinka himself in Dakar. He himself had to run to exile. He was in the US. And he came to Dakar. We met there. We chatted. We never discussed that issue whatsoever. But after we separated, then a friend of mine told me that, after our chat, Bajinka told him that, when he saw me, he kind of developed some goose pimples because he recalled how narrowly I escaped death in Kanilai. So that was it.
And when you met Major Bajinka on that particular occasion in Kanilai, did you know him before?
Not formally. Yes, we knew each other. Well, not formally per se. I used to see him, and I'm sure probably he also knew me from my journalism career, whatever. Yeah.
Was it strange that on that particular occasion he came and greeted you? Now that you look back,
I don't know. I mean, probably. But anyway, if it is true, well, he saved my life. Yeah.
And these are 2 death threats that you have received within a very short space of time. How did that make you feel?
Well, somehow not very secure, but I thought life must go on. And as a journalist, I was not going to give up, no matter what. In fact, I remember when Deyda was killed, that very night, I traveled out of the country. I came back to the country that very night. It was in the morning that I heard about what happened to him. A neighbor who heard the death probably thought that I was the one who was killed, and she came to the house to try and sympathize with my family, only to find me there. So these are the times that we've been going through. Yeah.
And why do you think that Deyda's identity was mistaken for yours?
Sorry, can I get that again?
Why do you think that his identity was mistaken for yours? Why did they think that it was you who was killed rather than Deyda Hydara?
Well, I wouldn't know, but probably because of the critical writings I've been doing, probably somebody thought if any journalist was to be killed, I could be one of them. Yeah.
You mentioned that you made a complaint about the first threat that you received. You made a complaint to the police. Did anything happen? I mean, did they get back to you? Was anything done?
No, never. Nobody ever came back to me about it. So as far as I'm concerned, there was no investigation on the matter.
Okay, very well, Mr. Jawo. I think we will stop here for today and continue our testimony tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have finished with the witness for today, and we will continue his testimony tomorrow morning.
Mr. Jawo seems quite energetic. I can go on until midnight, if that is okay with you, to try to match his energy with my own silence.
Indeed.
That's there, but we can call it a day. We'll hold our questions, I believe, until tomorrow at the end of his testimony. So if you don't have any other points, we will resume here tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.